Well, one of the problems with the word anarchism or anarchy is that it has a negative definition. So anarchism is opposition to bosses, rulers, oppression in general, right? Particularly in its sort of oppressive institutions, hierarchical institutions like the state, corporations, and so forth. One problem with a negative definition is that it just says what you're against. It doesn't say what you're for. And so it leaves kind of an opening to people defining what they're for in many different ways, in terms of like the tactics or strategies they want to use or their vision of what they want to create or whatever. So consequently, you have a very, very wide spectrum of people calling themselves anarchists. Okay, and that's particularly a problem in the U.S. because we don't really have an organizational history of like a particular organization that's well known as, like, you know, the traditional anarchist organization like you would have in Europe, because anarchism here got really trounced, smashed in the 1880s and 90s. So there's no anchor. There's no public political anchor for what it means. So people use the word to mean all different kinds of things, and that's a problem. So, including things I don't agree with, and things that I think are, you know, really wrong. And libertarian. So I prefer libertarian socialism because it has a positive definition in terms of what we're for. Okay. Also, it makes for the connection to what for me is important. Is I understand libertarian socialism as rooted in the principle from the First International that the emancipation of the working class is the work of the workers themselves. Now we can extend that to say that the liberation of the oppressed in general is through something that they will bring about through their own action. Has to be brought about through their own action. There's not going to be any saviors, you know, political leaders, politicians, whatever, that will bring about the liberation of the mass of the people from various forms of oppression and exploitation. So that means we have to get rid of capitalism. And getting rid of capitalism means that we need to create an economy where instead of some people, you know, owning means of production and then forcing others to work for them, to prevent that, the society or the community in general has to own the means of production. That's the basis of our common life together, our common production system that produces goods and services that we all consume. Why libertarian? Well, a libertarian is someone for whom liberty is a primary value. Now, the thing is that liberty itself is an essentially contested concept, meaning that there's a political fight over what it means. And so we have the right-wing libertarians and we have left-wing libertarians like us. And I sort of like to understand this in terms of the distinction between positive and negative liberty. So negative liberty, which is what negative liberty we would define as the absence of coercion or physical restraints, like people being, if you're not imprisoned then you're free, right? You're not being physically constrained, or you're not being coerced at the point of a gun or whatever, by not being interfered with by others. And so for the right-wing libertarians, and they define freedom only in terms of negative liberty. So that, for example, if you go out to get a job, you know, under capitalism, the working class doesn't own the means of production, so we're forced to work for the capitalists. Well, they would say it's a free contract. You enter into a free agreement with the capitalists, so you're not being coerced. Someone puts a gun to your head to accept the offer from the employer, right? Well, that's a poverty-stricken conception of liberty because it ignores the fact that we're forced, in fact, to work for the capitalists, because if you don't get a job, you're just going to be out on the street, you're going to be, you know, starving, you're going to be, you know, have a roof over your head. Those are very dire consequences. So to be in a situation where if you don't do something, there are dire consequences. You're forced to do that. So that's why we are forced to work for the capitalists. So right there, that's a denial of our freedom. And then we're forced to work for them under a regime, a managerial regime, the owners, the capitalists, set up, so that they then define the jobs, they define the aims of the work, they monitor us, control us, and so we are denied the control over our own work. Okay, now this brings me to positive freedom. Okay, positive freedom, capitalism fundamentally tramples, denies the positive freedom of the working class. It does so because positive freedom I think of as two things. First, the actual control over your life, the actual control over the decisions that directly affect you. So the capitalist control over our work and over the workplace is a direct trampling and denial of self-management in work. The second aspect, I would say, of positive liberty is having the real means available to you to develop your potential, to develop your skills, and also to maintain the abilities you have, such as your health, your physical abilities. And that's another thing that capitalism denies to us. I mean, in this country, we do not have, for example, a free universal healthcare system. And the educational system is set up in a very class-structured sort of way, so that the kind of education that most working class kids go to, it's very, very rigidly, it's all nowadays around testing and controlling the student. And the idea here is that the kids get inured to this close control regime because that's the kind of work they're going to be doing. Whereas now, people that go to college, which is, and go through college, in college you have more, freedom to speak have your own thoughts and develop your ideas. And that's preparing you for the kind of middle layers of occupations, professionals, people in management. And then you have the elite universities, Harvard and so forth, that are training people to be at the very top, to be run the government, run the corporations, So if you look at the educational system, it's basically a channel, it has these various channels that funnel people into their class slots in this class system, okay? So what happens then is through the educational system, the way it's structured, and through the way in which work is redesigned to concentrate decision-making and authority and expertise into a few people, and then to create jobs that are relatively de-skilled and dead-end jobs, that denies to the working class the opportunity, the real opportunity to develop their personal skills, their personal potential, because it creates largely de-skilled, relatively unskilled jobs. The working class the employers don't hire the working class most of them, to develop their skills and potential and to have discretion and be able to call the shots on the job and that kind of thing. They want people to do what they're told, right? So the way capitalism structures production denies the people the real opportunity to develop their skills and develop their abilities. That's a denial of positive liberty. And it denies people control over their work lives. That's a denial of self-management. So the system is really a system of oppression. Capitalism is a system of oppression. It's not a system of freedom, because it fundamentally tramples positive liberty. And that's what the so-called the right-wing, what I call fake libertarians, that's of course what they don't recognize. And they don't recognize it because the freedom that they're concerned with is the freedom of the employers, the freedom of the owners, the freedom of landlords and bosses. That's whose freedom they're concerned with. They're not concerned with the freedom of the working class. So the left libertarian perspective historically, since it arose originally as a tendency within the radical wing of the labor movement, is for the freedom of the working class and, by extension, the freedom of the oppressed in general.